Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Radcast on the topic of ideation. And I'm happy to be joined by my colleague Michael in Thailand. Michael, how are you doing out there?
Doing well, Jamin. Good to be here.
Great to have you. All right, please jump in anytime, Michael. We're talking today on the topic of ideation, which is the first stage in the fourth stage process of radical collective intelligence. What am I talking about? Let me do a quick screen share here. As we know from previous videos in this series, radical collective intelligence is the goose that lays the golden eggs of solutions to the world's most daunting problems, including solutions to abrupt climate change and other problems. Well, how does the goose generate these solutions? What does it do? What's happening inside the goose? Well, let's go deep inside the goose to find out. Inside the goose, as inside of a cow, we will find four stomachs, and these are analogous to the four stages of radical collective intelligence. The first stage, the topic of this video is ideation, but just to put it into context, from ideation we go to design, from design to modeling and optimization of solutions or potential solutions, and then finally to implementation. The golden eggs only become golden eggs when they're implemented out in the real world. So let's delve into ideation. What do we mean by ideation, and how do we propose to do that? Well, as we'll see as we delve in, there are two parts to ideation: the synchronous part, that which happens at the same time, and the asynchronous part, which happens at different times. The synchronous part, you can have everything from, text messaging or emailing, all the way up to this very rich form of communication that we're experiencing right now, which is not just video conferencing, but it's video conferencing with whiteboarding, which I'm doing on my iPad, screen sharing, which I'm doing on yet another computer. It's a multimedia experience. And the video conferencing part is very, very important, because even though you're not talking, Michael, I can see your face, I can see your expressions, even when you're not talking, and vice versa. So, it's the reason people have meetings as opposed to just doing everything by phone, right? We get to see each other. So it's one of the reasons. And now that's synchronous. It's extremely rich. And what we're doing within radical collective intelligence, we're recording and broadcasting these video conferences to disseminate them, yes, but also to record them so that subsequently we can use artificial intelligence to transcribe the text that is said, transcribe the words that are said into text, and use other flavors of artificial intelligence to then index that text, map it to various taxonomies, such as we'll see examples of in a few minutes on this very video, et cetera, et cetera. So really, all of that you could think of as really, juicing or milking the most out of a given conversation. I mean, what better way to do that than to record it, broadcast it, share it, transcribe it, index it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's really kind of juicing the most out of it. We've talked a little bit about the synchronous part of the conversations. We'll talk more about that. But first, let's go to the asynchronous part, because there's there are really fascinating aspects to that as well. And so for that, and Michael, please jump in anytime, even in the middle of me sharing or anything like that. So let me share this video given by Dr. Tony McCaffrey. It's less than 4 minutes long and published here on the Harvard Business Review. Please listen carefully and watch carefully, particularly once we get about a minute and a half in. It gets really, really interesting.
I'm Dr. Tony McCaffrey. Brainstorming, the practice of sharing ideas while withholding judgment, rose to popularity in the early 1950s with the promise of producing more ideas.
Jamin?
The problem is, it never worked.
Oh my goodness.
No study has shown...
I'm sorry, I forgot to screen share. Let me start that over. Thank you, Michael. All right, here goes. Thank you. Okay. Again, it gets really interesting about a minute and a half in, but the whole thing is interesting. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Tony McCaffrey.
Hi, I'm Dr. Tony McCaffrey. Brainstorming, the practice of sharing ideas while withholding judgment, rose to popularity in the early 1950s with the promise of producing more ideas. The problem is, it never worked. No study has shown that brainstorming produces more ideas than people just working alone for a while and then coming together to share their ideas and build on them. It doesn't work because sharing one idea at a time, by talking no less, is incredibly inefficient. Further, extroverts always dominate introverts and hamper idea generation, even if you have a talented facilitator. Brainstorming, an approach I pioneered with my colleagues, directly challenges the foundation of brainstorming by asking, why do we need to talk in the first place? This idea is probably best explained using an example from the lives of insects. Ants solve problems by leaving signals in their environment that influence the behavior of the others. When searching for food, successful ants leave traces of pheromones along their trails, a signal to the other ants that there's a path to dinner. If we make a problem-solving graph, then humans can quietly leave their signals, that is, their ideas, for others to build upon. In a brainstorming graph, the goal grows downward into refined sub-goals. Resources are interacted together and grow upward. When the two directions connect, solutions start to emerge. Let's see how brainstorming would handle a classic management problem, like this real-life conundrum at the company Pacific Power and Light. Winter storms in the Cascade Mountains leave power lines loaded with ice, which if left unattended will break the lines. Having workers climb the poles to shake the lines is both dangerous and time-consuming. Management searched for a better method for years. What if they had used brainstorming? To start, they would simply place the goal at the top of the brainstorming graph and a few known resources at the bottom. Then the group would be instructed not to talk, but to simply add post-it notes and drawn lines to the graph. People who are naturally top-down thinkers would start refining the goal. Other naturally bottom-up thinkers would analyze how the resources could be used, or they would add new resources. Pretty soon, the two directions would connect, an indication that the group is finding ways to use the resources to solve the problem. This figure shows a careful refinement of the goal, as well as Pacific Power and Light's actual solution of using the helicopter's downdraft to shake the lines enough to remove the ice. Other solutions are also shown, including using a helicopter to drop a de-icing agent onto the lines, and using the conducted electricity to generate enough heat to melt the ice on the outside of the lines. We don't know for sure whether using brainstorming would have helped Pacific Power and Light come up with an effective solution more quickly. But our pilot work shows that brainstorming produces up to 115 ideas in 15 minutes versus 100 ideas per hour for traditional brainstorming. By switching from talking to writing on a structured graph, brainstorming greatly improves the effectiveness of group work.
All right, thank you, Dr. McCaffrey. So the advantages of that, I think he made very, very clear and are really inspiring in terms of efficiency and productivity. I would also say in the fact that it creates a full spectrum of possible solutions by fanning out and into all the possible, he calls them sub-goals. I actually call them ways. We call them ways of solving problems. So the full spectrum of what are all the possible ways, that's an extremely important part. And then it, further breaks those down into what I like to refer to as subways and sub-subways ad infinitum. Only that way do you know that you've really covered the full spectrum. And now, if we then go back and look at certain ways and subways and sub-subways and then start talking about how we might use certain resources, that can be done as an individual activity, but it can also be done as a group activity. And in fact, there's a really rich dialectic between, here, let me just show it once again here on the iPad, a really rich dialectic between that asynchronous part that Dr. McCaffrey so well articulated and the synchronous part, which we're doing right now through a live video conference. Now I want to show something else, which is how we expand upon Dr. McCaffrey's brainstorming methodology. And I mean, here, I just want to talk about, like, this particular solution of using, de-icing agent dropped from a helicopter, that needs to be talked about, right? There are so many reasons that's a bad idea, right? But that wouldn't necessarily surface until you get a whole group of people together. Anyway, why? Because there are unintended consequences, very negative unintended consequences in this case, both of using a helicopter and using some chemical agent. So anyway, this synchronous conversation is extremely important. So now let's look at how we're expanding upon that idea to use it not just to solve one problem, removing ice from power lines, for example, but actually all of the world's problems, not just simultaneously, but also holistically. So at the top here, you see whole world in the holistic sense. What does our world need in order to be whole? You could say, and one way of breaking it down, and there's lots of ways to break it down, but one would be to say, well, for the world to be whole, we need wholeness for people and wholeness for the planet. Well, what does that mean? Well, wholeness for people, you can further break that down into physical needs and social, spiritual needs. Physical needs like food and shelter and wellness, and etc. You can see the examples here on the screen. And wholeness for the planet, well, it means wholeness for air, the atmosphere, wholeness for water, for land, for all ecosystems and species. And you can continue to break that down until we get to what we call fine grain and measurable leaf nodes to this inverted tree, or this taxonomy. In this case, it's a teleological taxonomy with the telos of a whole world. And for each of those leaf node needs, we need to find solutions to fulfill those needs. Many of those needs are currently being met. Others are notably going unmet, such as attending to the needs of a whole atmosphere, or an atmosphere that contributes holistically to the well-being of the entire planet and all of the ecosystems. So again, these are all the specific needs of a whole world as you break it down to the measurable and very specific. By the way, one of those needs is actually the need to remove ice from power lines, right? But it's just one. Now consider the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of specific needs of a whole world. Okay, so what do we do with all these needs? Well, first, just to kind of summarize the brainstorming methodology, just pictorially here. Again, I call these ways, these dark orange boxes, to use the same color code as Dr. McCaffrey, and these subways and these sub-subways. And then you have combinations of resources, as we show here with this little pyramid, these three resources being combined, and solutions in the middle, using resources to fulfill upon a certain way of fulfilling a need. Now consider that we apply this simultaneously and holistically to multiple needs in parallel. Ultimately, we need to apply this methodology to meet all the needs of a whole world. But let's just take a look at these three, just kind of for starters, conceptually. And you can imagine that for a given solution, as represented by this blue sort of oval-shaped thing, in addition to fulfilling upon this need that solution maps to as its intended consequence, these red lines represent negative unintended consequences, such as the ones I was referring to in the case of the solution of a helicopter dropping de-icing agent. Now, more generally, any given solution will have, as you can see with this thick blue line here, the intended impact that it's seeking to have on fulfilling this particular need. Various unintended negative consequences, as indicated by the red lines, and then unintended positive consequences that are indicated by the blue lines. So when we're considering several different solutions, we can imagine this entire spaghetti factory of impacts on the various needs of a whole world. So we're talking about the analysis of different solutions in parallel, and as we map out all the different solutions that we'll need over the course of that process, in the conversational domain, we'll be analyzing and saying, well, look, you know, a lot of needs are being met over here in this realm by this methodology, but you know what, we're still not quite solving this really important one here in the middle. Let's talk about that, and in fact, let's maybe, you know, convene the right groups of people to work on that. And so folks may be drawn from different groups over here to form a new group highlighted in yellow that can then, you know, go in like a, you know, Delta force and get in there and work on putting together solutions to meet some of these unmet needs over here, whether they be atmospheric or human or ecological, whatever the domain is. And ultimately, as more and more people participate in radical collective intelligence, we'll have an abundance of people, including many, many experts in various areas. Everyone's an expert in something, and many of us are experts in lots of things. In order to go about, you know, one professor at UC Irvine once told me that expertise exists on the head of a pin, right? And you can imagine the world being covered by a whole bunch of pins sticking upward. On the head of each pin is expertise in some very specific micro niche, right? Whether it be in permaculture or in medicine or in history, in the study of history, whatever. Okay, so that's why we need a big population of individuals spanning various areas of expertise. As we build out these solutions, we can then simulate different combinations of solutions, kind of doing that spaghetti factory type analysis, but in a much more scientific and precise way. And then we can model the impacts, positive, negative, neutral, of each solution or proposed solution. And we can look at the results. And then we can, you know, take it steps further and build an optimization layer around that, all in order to generate the optimal set of solutions, which both filters all the solutions that are generated and then determines exactly how much of each should be deployed where and when, in what order, etc., all with a view to generating optimal results. So anyway, that kind of shows how we've taken Dr. McCaffrey's brilliant brainstorming methodology and applied it sort of en masse to all of the world's problems and needs simultaneously and holistically. So we see huge, huge potential for developing this dialectic between the synchronous and the asynchronous. How you feeling, Michael? And what you thinking about all this? I know you're one of the, you know, key architects of much of what we've just been covering here. So
sure.
Anyway. Mm-hmm.
Well, what jumps out at me is how the very incorporation or integration of Dr. Tony McCaffrey's, you know, brainstorming model into a collective intelligence platform is an example, right, of collective intelligence in action, because there's so many, you know, we could call them off-the-shelf solutions that need to be cobbled together in intelligent ways, you know, that need to be networked, right? A whole network of platforms. This provides, you know, a way, in an effective way, an efficient way to solve problems. Yes, and you are going through the dynamic of it, but then to be able to map that to this larger taxonomy, you know, of solutions, of needs, of resources, right? Those are all a part of, you know, the brainstorming model, but that doesn't mean that storming doesn't still have its proper place, as you put it, Jamin, that, you know, one person thinking in this case may be, you know, one recorded hangout, wherein at the end of it, they decide what the Post-it note is going to be that they put up on, you know, on that brainstorming taxonomy.
Yeah.
And there you have the synchronicity of real-time conversations, right? Recorded hangouts, and the asynchronicity of the brainstorming, where they leave the signals or traces for others to follow.
Yeah, and I think you know, the example that we highlighted of, you know, a helicopter dropping de-icing agent on power lines in order to de-ice them, you know, where in an emergency that, you know, that there may be cases that where that might be justified, but in general, I think you know, we can certainly do a lot better. But imagine that we would only uncover that through having, you know, rich perspectives of different people who can look beyond just the immediate objective, right? You know, a helicopter pilot who's the son of an executive at a chemical company that makes de-icing agent, for them it may just make all the sense in the world to use these two wonderful tools at once to get ice off of power lines. But, you know, obviously they have a perspective which is influenced by many factors. So anyway, that's just, for me, a great example of the potential and the need for a dialectic. In fact, if you look at that one example, it's sort of kind of a microcosm of what's wrong with humanity on planet Earth. We're a tool-using species. Each of us gets really excited about, this new tool. I made it. Me. You know, and they just want to start manufacturing their tools and selling them all over the world. And our society, our culture supports that. In fact, it celebrates it. It encourages it, right? The American dream, American innovation, you know, more tools are better kind of thing. But anyway, what we're pioneering here is, yes, you know, have innovation that allows for individuals to, you know, come up with great ideas through the asynchronous part, but also allow individuals to come up with even better ideas through the synchronous part. And yes, in fact, be able to shoot down bad ideas, as we've been talking about with the helicopter and the de-icing agent. So anyway,
yeah, and by having you know, a record of the various attempts to solve problems, it becomes a part of problem solving in the future. A failed solution in one situation may be precisely the needed, you know, solution in another. In the brainstorming model, it allows for that, and especially as you go on to map it in relation to radical collective intelligence.
Yeah, totally. No,
in terms of consequences, unintended consequences, right?
Yeah.
Sets of solutions, this holistic approach.
Yeah,
takes in, yeah.
No, and I love what you were just mentioning there. I'd like to explore that a little bit about the you know, doing kind of like analysis, sort of like post-mortem analysis on, okay, hey, you know, hey, this is a really successful solution that emerged from this process. What about the process contributed to that? What about the individuals contributed to that? What about the combinations of individuals that contributed to that? What about the layers of artificial intelligence that participated in that? And then so we can learn from our, you know, from all the steps that went into generating that solution so that we can make the process better. So we can, you know, massage the goose and make her better at laying better and better golden eggs, right? So, you know, one aspect of that, and this is something you and I have had a lot of fun developing. So let me share this on the screen here. What we call the conversation tree. So imagine, and I'll show a real life example of this in a moment. So imagine we have one conversation, this green box on the bottom, and then, you know, a few minutes or hours or days or weeks later, we have a second conversation, you know, along the same lines. There's like a certain objective we want to get to, or a certain telos, or simply a certain focus, however broad or narrow, and so on. So we go on having these various conversations, one after the other, and then imagine that at some point, sooner or later, we sort of build this branch. I'm going to highlight it in blue that goes off to the right in this direction. One conversation here, followed by another there, followed by another there. That's, you know, essentially either a tangent or some specific topic that we want to drill into that came from here, that came from this second conversation, in this case, in the green series, and, you know, forms the blue series that goes on, and so on. As you can see, we can branch off of that. And as you see in this example up here, we can branch off of that and branch off of that and branch off of that, and ad infinitum into all these different directions of specificity. So it can be very fractal-like. And so if at the end of all this exploration, it turned out to be this conversation over here, and this conversation over here, and this conversation over here, and this one over here, and this one over here, right, that all contributed to a key insight being derived that, you know, led to the development of a certain critical solution, key solution that was very much needed. We'll be able to do this kind of analysis, right, using artificial intelligence and matching the patterns and saying, you know, what were the elements or ingredients or synchronicity or sequentiality or myriad factors that went into this ultimate successful solution being developed, right? So remember, I promised a real life example. Let me show a real life example of that. And we covered this on the very first video, Invitation to Tech Sector to Join the Race for Solutions to Climate Change. If you haven't seen it, please start there and then backtrack over all these in order. This is a series of conversations, just like that green, you know, little skyscraper we showed on the screen a few moments ago, okay? And then this is a series that branches off from this one. And then this is a series which branches off from this one. And even these are branching off in both this case and this case. The new series, like this one, is branching off of the very most recent one. We could very easily go back here and backfill and say, like, go to stage 4 and say, okay, let's build, you know, let's talk about stage 4.1 within stage 4, stage 4.2, 4.3, etc. branch, and then, you know, from 4.2 we could branch and say, you know, all right, let's develop that substage even in more detailed level, 4.2.1, 4.2.2, 2.3, you get the idea, and so on, okay? So that's a real life example, right? This is a real life example of this concept over here of a conversation tree. And let me also talk about how, you know, we could form a whole different tree over here on a whole other mix of topics, and, you know, have other branching here and branching wherever, here, there, and everywhere. And then one very important construct that we like to talk about and actually implement is the construct of what we call a sky bridge. Okay, so imagine that we form that from, let's just say, this conversation here, the top of that one, and this conversation here. We take those two conversations, the participants in those conversations, leveraging not just the information contained in those specific conversations, but here, where did this conversation come from? Well, it came from this, here I'm going to highlight it in pink in the upper right here. It came from this series here, which in turn branched off of this series here, which in turn branched off of this series here, right? Imagine that these two conversations, we form a sky bridge between the two. Now there's direct communication, and in some sense we are, benevolently scooping or subsuming all that came before, both of those, right? Notice, actually, you know what? This is what came before. What's outside the gold boundary did not come before, did not precede it. I just want to be clear about that. So it includes all that came before and builds off of it, right? And so we might then see a new skyscraper, a new series of conversations growing from the middle of the sky bridge, right? How cool is that? And so, more generally, we can imagine a whole network of conversations or conversational trees, right? Conversation trees, plural. And the whole network of trees and the connections between them, the sky bridges between them. And we can, we can imagine, in fact, multi-origin sky bridges. So a sky bridge that emerges, let me draw it in this deep red here, this radish red. Sky bridge that emerges from this conversation and this conversation and this conversation and this conversation, right? That's sky bridge. So you can have as many parents, and that's one of the constructs that we're pioneering on the radish conversational domain, where we actually implement all this stuff. You can have as many parents as you want for a given conversation. So again, this that you're seeing here is implemented. Here's a real life implementation of that, which you are now living. Here you are in the third conversation in this particular series that I'm highlighting. All right, well, we've talked about a lot within the context of the relatively simple story to begin with of, whoops, I lost where I was in my sketch here. Oh yeah, I remember. In this big picture of the synchronous part, the asynchronous part, the dialectic between the two, so you can imagine, just imagine how cool it would be to map out in parallel and track in parallel the evolution of the conversational trees, which are impacting a specific solution development, and the evolution of the Dr. Tony McCaffrey brainstorming graphs, right, that culminate in that same solution. Imagine that. There's just so much richness that the AI can study and analyze and perfect, to encourage more successful solutions and discourage the unsuccessful ones, from having too much resource spent on them. That's a relatively fine point, but there's a lot of fine points to this. Anyway, Michael is the, again, proud father, or one of the proud fathers, speaking of multi-parents, of this great framework.
My two dads.
Anyway, your input is more than welcome. It's actually vitally needed to keep pushing this thing forward.
Yeah, well, the ability to have a conversation, in essence, this very same conversation taking place, both, in real time, right? And through time. It's and not just in a way where we talk about, you know, the discourse that's taking place online, which is a very diffuse kind of description, right, of having a conversation, but actually being a very active participant in a conversation that has as its common aim, right, the solving of a set of problems, right? That I think is an exciting prospect that we're exploring here, and more than exploring. But on the face of it, it sounds simple, but to be able to put those, you know, Post-it notes up, right, for others to see, and then for those to be able to be rearranged, as it were, right, reordered, something. It's kind of like a game of Scrabble, you know, or a word game where you're, you know, you're just kind of riffing off of each other's, you know, ideations, right? And what may prove to be a dead end in one direction may open up a whole, you know, new pathway in another.
You know, since you mentioned that, Michael, I just want to highlight something that where you did exactly that. So as we were mapping out in one of our Radish design meetings, the whole conversational domain, all these like skyscrapers, and bridges, and all that, you came up with the both conceptual and design innovation that, hey, what if we, you know, take this whole thing and actually blow it up? I'll just draw a couple of pictures here and then I'll show what I mean. Boom, right? What if we blow this whole thing up into all of the individual constituent Lego blocks? It must be in your blood. We've got Danish blood and Legos are from Denmark. But anyway, you said, let's break it up into all these Lego blocks and let whoever wants to come along and grab whatever Lego blocks they want. And I'll just kind of show a conceptual picture of it on this next screen and build a series of conversations, which might include this Lego block, and then this one on top of that, 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 you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And likewise with the branching and everything else. And so that's given us a whole lot more degrees of freedom in terms of playing with these conversational elements and actually conceiving of a conversation like a Lego block. Why not? And in fact, that inspired us to, you know, build out, like for example, the series we're going to build out on holistic land management. We'll give maybe a 3-minute introduction to that, followed by a Lego block created by Alan Savory, you know, one of the godfathers, if not the preeminent godfather of holistic land management. And what a guy. And then followed by an 1 and 45-minute interview I did of him, you know, a few years back. So anyway, thank you for that, Michael. And also what a great example of, you know, what you just said in action, right? So we invite, bring your best design and conceptual and logical and technological innovations to the platforms of radical collective intelligence as you possibly can. Just bring them. Follow Michael's example. Bring your ideas. All right. Well, I think we've really covered a lot of ground here. Let me just do a brief, just sort of super fast recap of where we've been, and then and just briefly where we're going. So we started by talking about the goose that lays the golden eggs, which is the meta solution of radical collective intelligence. This, and we asked, okay, what's inside the goose? We opened her up and found 4 different stomachs. The first of which is ideation, which we've been talking about today. Next, we'll get on to design. How do you take an idea and then turn it into a detailed design? And And then we saw the great work of Dr. Tony McCaffrey. Such as this example of brainstorming, asynchronous ideation, generation of ideas. We talked about some good, some bad, and some ugly ideas, like the one highlighted in the middle. And we then talked about how we can apply this methodology to generate ideas for solutions to create a whole world. And we rooted down into that, and including the very example that Dr. Tony McCaffrey talked about, and many others, in fact, all other needs of a whole world. Solutions emerging, multiple solutions with myriad intended and unintended consequences. The unintended consequences can be positive or negative. The conversational domain has this beautiful dialectic between the asynchronous domain of brainstorming and how that can generate myriad solutions. Talked about the simulation. This comes later, even after design, is the simulation of solutions, which is 2 stomachs later after ideation. And then we saw, we talked about real world example and what we're doing in this particular conversational tree. And we talked about conversational trees generally and innovations thereupon and all kinds of cool stuff. So with that, I think it's probably a pretty good time to move towards wrapping up. Anything else to add, Michael? This is such an important topic. Let's really take our time. Let's not be in a hurry on this one.
Yeah, well, I look forward to building off of the groundwork we've laid here, because just as you've diagrammed there, Jamin, we're going to go off into a number of different directions. First, starting by, I suppose, building that primary, pole, right? The tree trunk, as it were, that we can then branch out from. So looking forward to the next one.
Awesome. Great. So the next one will be on design, and please join us. And we look forward to everyone's comments. Please participate in this conversation that we're having asynchronously, in this case, by writing your comments or questions in the to this YouTube video. All right, and then you can join radish.org, and there's much richer ways to participate as well. All right, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you all for watching and participating in this conversation. We'll see you on the next one on design. Thanks so much.
Thanks.